Sorry, I'm Adrian Bell, and I'm talking to my colleague today. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Andrew Prescott from the University of Glasgow.
So we're going to cover a couple of themes now, Andrew. We'll start. People are interested in the nature of revolt always, and people argue, is this a rural revolt or is it an urban revolt? Or perhaps we're finding it's something completely different. What are your thoughts on that question?
So if you look in Wikipedia, that great font of knowledge on later medieval revolts, you'll see that they've helpfully divided many of the disturbances in Europe between rural and urban revolts. And the English revolt of 1381 is placed firmly in the rural category. But we have to take account of the fact that very many towns took a very active part in the rising. If you look at the disturbances in Kent, the major disturbances are in towns like Canterbury, Rochester, Dartford. It's actually very much a series of events in the town, and that's where many of the rebels are drawn from. And the sense that I increasingly get, and I think that our project is confirming, is that the success and the threat of the revolt of 1381 came from the way in which it fused together grievances in the towns and grievances in the countryside. If you look at, for example, the disturbances in Yorkshire, which have traditionally been seen very much as outliers of the revolt, and some books on the revolt even ignore them altogether as sort of nothing to do with the main revolt and so on. You can see that a lot of the grievances that are occurring in the towns, York particularly, are very similar to those that you find further south. In York, there was dissension about the way in which the tax demands and the other financial demands that were being made in support of the war were being distributed, the way in which some people in York were profiteering from the war, and others were having to shoulder the burden of providing resources for the crown. So it's actually kind of very much in the same dynamic as we see further south. And we've got direct alliances between urban populations and rural populations. The best known example of that, of course, is St Albans, where the relatively wealthy townsfolk had resented the way in which the abbey controlled their right to, for example, hold markets or mill their own flour, and limited things like where they could, the rights of their local parish churches, and so on. From a very early point, the townsfolk of St Albans sought an alliance with the more rural rebels of Essex and Kent, and played an active part in the events in London. Similarly, at a place like Abingdon in Berkshire, there was resentment at the control of the abbey over the life of the town. And they actually have, again, very similar tactics and grievances to the ones that we see in more rural areas. They claimed that because the king had held land there anciently, that they had exemptions from the rights that the abbey claimed, and this was one of the reasons for the rising. So I think what we're increasingly disentangling from the revolt is the way in which there was a fusion between urban and rural grievance in 1381, and that was a lot of the reason why the revolt developed onto such a large scale, and one of the reasons why it posed such a threat to the government.
Yeah, it's really interesting that a lot of things in history aren't quite what perhaps people try and classify them as, and I'll follow that up now by moving on to the moniker of this rebellion that we're investigating is the Peasants' Revolt. And I suppose what a lot of people suspect is that maybe lots of the rebels aren't peasants. And is there a good example of a rebel who would surprise us in that description, Andrew?
Yeah, the term peasants' revolt was actually only popularised by a Victorian historian called John Richard Green. He was the one who encouraged us to call it the peasants' revolt. It had all sorts of other names before that, and the fact that that's not a wholly appropriate terminology for it is illustrated by people like one of the leaders of the Kentish rebels who marched to London, a man called Thomas ap Raven, who came from Rochester in Kent. And it seems that Rochester, sadly, we haven't got enough early records for Rochester, but it seems that the dissension in Rochester was an important factor in feeding into the revolt. And Raven was a merchant from Rochester who had dealings with other merchants in London, made a lot of money there, owned property in Rochester, had acted as MP for the city in 1378. So we don't really expect the Peasants' Revolt to include MPs. But the head of the Kentish rebels was somebody who'd been an MP only 3 years previously. And he'd also, under a different name, Thomas Kemp, served in undertaking military service a few years previously. So he's a very well-to-do man, probably somebody who knew a lot of the gentry and others that they were attacking personally. And here he was leading up the revolt, and it's a very good illustration of the way in which people of all types beneath the aristocracy joined the rebellion.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think thinking contemporarily, I suppose we wouldn't be so surprised to see MPs or even our Prime Minister breaking the law, as we're reminded of.
Be surprised to see him at the head of a protest, though, protest demonstration. I mean, it's not part. I mean, I think the involvement of someone like Raven is actually, in a curious way, reminiscent of the trouble of the Capitol under Donald Trump on the 6th of January, 2021. That it's members of the political class actually actively supporting and engaging in violent protests. With somebody like Raven, you can see that.
And then I think the final piece for this section is, I guess, a lot of things we were looking at when we started the project was the military experience of the rebels. And what do you think? What sort of themes are coming out from our investigations so far in terms of that military experience, Andrew?
It's not a straight read over from soldiers to rebels, but there's very, very clear indication that the military background was feeding very directly into the disturbances in 1381. And the sort of people with soldier background we can trace in very distinct roles, I would say. First, like Thomas at Raven, there are a number of people with military engagement who led distinct groups of the rebels. There's a man called Blake who lived in Ware in Hertfordshire, who'd recently been recruited for military service, who led one of the largest groups from Hertfordshire into London, and Raven's another one. There's some people from Manningtree in Essex. So some of these groups actually have military leaders. That's very distinct. In some case, deserters are involved. So there's a clear connection there with grumbling about the nature of the military service. A man called Thomas Wootton was involved as one of the leader of the Kentish rebels whose orders had been taken out because he was accused of deserting military service. Then beyond that, I think we can see individual soldiers using their military expertise in support of the rising. Our best example of that is probably a man who was accused of using something like a siege engine in the destruction of a house of the steward of the Archbishop of Canterbury near Maidstone, who we can again trace as having military experience. Others acted as messengers. We can trace people who had been with groups of soldiers either serving in France immediately before the rising or waiting to go and serve in France, who go straight back to join the rising. One example, a man called John Pepper, is supposed to have actually had a lance with a pennant, and that sounds very much like he'd gone straight back from his military service to undertake that activity. The final element, I think, that we've picked out in terms of the military experience is a suggestion that people who were involved in provisioning in some way or in mercantile support for the rising were involved. And there are various people. One merchant, for example, a man called Quineld, who was from Southampton, who's been actively involved, apparently, in provisioning for the army. So that's there as well. But I think you have to also bear in mind the overall context, which is one that it's not simply soldiers causing trouble, but there's sort of widespread discontent and unease about the way in which the bill for the war is being distributed at the time, particularly amongst towns. And I think that brings us back to the town-country dichotomy, that it's that general discontent about the way in which the war is going, which fuses the town and country together.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm sure that's going to be a fascinating part of our researches going forward.